Well, Jake, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I was telling you earlier that my intention for the podcast is to help alleviate suffering. And I know that you also have that same mission. You address drugs and alcohol. And I specifically wanted to talk to you because of your expertise around helping people stop smoking weed. Do we call it cannabis or all the things?
You could call it so many different things. I think people will know what you're talking about. Uh,
Yeah.
One of my favorite iterations lately is that I heard was the Lord's lettuce.
So funny. Man, when we love something, we give it all kinds of pet names, don't we?
Yes, we do.
Dude, that was my drug of choice. Like, I don't talk about it a lot because I don't know why. But dude, weed was my drug of choice by far. Like
Same.
alcohol, was it? Yeah, alcohol brought me to my knees, but I recognized early in the recovery process that I absolutely had to quit smoking weed too. And so I realized I don't really talk about that a whole lot. I was smoking so much weed that not being high was my altered reality.
Same. Yes. In fact, in high school, when I would go to school sober on very rare occasions, people would look at me funny and say, "Are you high?" Like
Really?
yeah, it happened consistently. When I wasn't high, my friends thought I was on something.
Oh, isn't that because you were different? You were different
Yeah,
than the norm.
high was my normal.
Well, even in
Yeah,
high school.
in high school. Yeah, it
How
started
how old
early.
how old were you when you started? What was the first time?
I was 14 years old.
Oh, same.
Yep. And that seems to be such a common age for these things.
Yeah.
14 years old. I think many people are going into high school, right? First year of high school, big change happening. For
Mm.
me, we had changed towns, and I went from a very small, very nurturing middle school with 100 people in it total to a high school of almost 4,000.
That's a huge school.
It was huge, and I didn't know anyone, like pretty much nobody. And that was very stressful for my system at the time.
Yeah.
And when cannabis was presented to me, it came through channels that I trusted. It came through um, older people that I looked up to. It came through family, um, and it was just so clearly the coolest thing that I could possibly do. You know, it was like to
Yes,
to
I know.
smoke weed with these older kids and be one of the cool kids and then to have it and be the guy who has it that I can give it to other people. And of course, I made a business out of that at that time.
Nice.
Um, but yeah, it came early to me,
Yeah.
and it
Man,
was definitely my drug of choice.
all those things you mentioned, any one of those things in and of itself would be an incredible stressor at 14. Changing schools, moving, small school to big school. That's intense. That's really intense. Um, before we jump, I'm gonna ask you more about your story, but before we jump in, I like to front load the episode with some resources. So we'll go. I keep saying it's a lightning round, and then I say it's not. I need to find another way to intro this part because I say the same thing every time. But anyway, you want to play? Want to play a little game?
I'm so down. Let's do it.
Okay. So early in your recovery, I know you kind of have two sober dates. You have an alcohol date and a weed date, but let's go all the way back to the beginning. What,
Mhm.
10 years ago? Is that where?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. No, a little over 9 years.
Okay.
Mhm.
So let's go back to that time when you first started your, let's call it your recovery journey. Was there a book that helped change your mind or helped you start your journey to recovery?
You know, it's so funny. I was listening to your Tommy Rosen interview, and
Yeah,
first of all, let me just say, I'm so unbelievably excited to be here
it's so cute.
already with the work that you do and with this podcast and how amazing it is. Like, I'm so honored to be here. And
You're making me cry already.
I'm I'm such a I'm such a huge Tommy Rosen fan, and
Yeah.
such an admirer of his work, that and I look up to him so much. The fact that you interviewed him on this podcast is it just has me like over the moon right now. I cannot believe that
Aw.
I'm doing an interview with you and Tommy Rosen did an interview with you. So I say that because one of the books that came into my world early was Recovery 2.0.
Yeah, he wrote that in 2014, I think.
I also say that because it blew my mind listening to your interview with Tommy Rosen when you asked him this same question, and he named the first two books he named are the first two books I would name: The Alchemist and Siddhartha. Those played a huge role. I didn't read The Alchemist until later, but Siddhartha I read around the same time that I started smoking cannabis.
Mm.
And something of the transmission of wisdom that is in that book planted itself in my soul, and it helped me. It helped me not be any worse than I was in addiction, and it helped me definitely have a spiritual connection that allowed me to cultivate and deepen a, a sort of spirituality for myself that helped me with my recovery later on.
Oh, that's really beautiful. Anywhere where you can find spiritual connection, I think is so important. And thank you for all your kind words. I mean, you just made my day.
Oh, you're so welcome. Yeah,
I was
I'm
like, I'll
so
give you 10
thrilled.
minutes to stop that. Okay, those are really good books. Do you have a go-to mantra or a quote or idea that you kind of live by?
My mind has produced, I think, as a combination of a lot of input and wisdom that I've soaked up from many, many different sources. One of the mantras that seems to have just emerged is, this is all one thing. I don't know why exactly that's the wording that has settled for me, but when I go about my life, it helps me to remember that all experiences are part of this sacred journey, that I am not separate from the universe, and that if I see, for example, a stunning and serene scene in nature of beauty and serenity and harmony, to remember that I'm the same thing as that, that that's the universe, I'm the universe, and it's all interconnected. That gives me a deep feeling of peace and belonging in my being.
Mm.
So that's become a mantra.
Man, dude, that is heavy. The peace and belonging and the idea that we are not separate. I'm sure you realize how deep that is, but that really strikes a chord in me because so often, I get people who are really at the beginning of their recovery journey. You need to meet people where they're at, right? And this idea of I'm terminally unique, I don't fit in anywhere, this idea of being separate, those are like root cause pain,
Mm, mm,
right? And
mhm.
really what people, I think, I can speak for myself, that at the end of the day, no matter what I'm striving for on the outside, the end result is always at the end of the day, peace and belonging. Like that desire for connectedness, I think is so intense as part of the human experience.
Yeah, and it's been really interesting to me to see that unity and recognizing unity is such a powerful pillar of so many spiritual practices. And I've often asked myself, why? Why is that? Because, we live in an age of science, and I
Mhm.
have lots of friends, and I know there are lots of minds out there that lean towards, if not staunchly, being scientific materialism, you know, And so I've had to ask myself, why does unity matter? Why does it matter that we can say this is all one thing instead of separate things? Because a scientific materialist might say, well, that's one way of looking at it, but so what? So what if it's all one thing? Does that change anything? And I think that meditating on this and reading and taking influence from different philosophies, what I see is that if we can recognize unity, we can accomplish two things. We can see that there's sacredness in the universe. We can see it as a mystery and perhaps a sacred mystery or a divine uh, reality, a divine existence, whatever that is, that sort of awe-inspiring presence of the universe and the mystery of it. If we can see sacredness in that, which you might say is a choice, you might say we could choose to see it as sacred, but if we can see sacredness in that, then what unity does is it allows us to recognize that that sacredness is also in us.
Oof.
So immediately with unity, you have self-love, self-admiration, and the experience of all of it as sacred, including yourself and including all experiences. And I think that that does a lot for looking at things, looking at the brighter side of things. And the second thing I think it does is gives us a sense of belonging. We can see that we belong here. And that core pain, as you said, can dissipate from that realization alone. So I think what unity gives us access to is sacredness and belonging, and that's why it makes such a difference to recognize it.
I love that. Why unity matters. That's really good. Do you have a regular self-care or recovery practice, whether it's something you do daily, or do you have a weekly like meeting schedule, or do you do annual retreats? What does that look like for you?
Great question. Yeah, it fluctuates a bit, but at the moment, I do 11 minutes of long, deep breathing
Very specific.
every. Well, yes, this is a. I have to say thank you, Tommy Rosen, because yeah, I did his 8 week awakening course. He had us doing a 45-minute long sadhana every single morning.
45 minutes. Okay.
And that was really challenging for me and so beneficial. And I loved it. And at the end of 8 weeks, I was like, okay, I need an alternative that's going to be sustainable for me.
Yeah.
And then he said, just do 11 minutes of long, deep breath. uh, if that's all you can do that every day. And that was sort of a suggestion he gave to the community as a good daily practice. And early on in my recovery journey, I had started to meditate, and I meditated 10 minutes every day in direct sunlight. And
Oh, good.
I love that practice and I highly recommend it to do meditation in direct sunlight if you can, just 10 minutes a day. So that's been kind of a core pillar. And that evolved for me over time into sitting on a regular basis in meditations from anywhere from 10 minutes to 2 hours long on any given evening. And I don't often sit for 2 hours, that's more rare, but I go through phases, and sometimes I'm sitting, on a daily basis for 30 minutes, an hour, 90 minutes, and other times I'm just getting my 11-minute deep breath practice in with maybe a few minutes of hanging out in meditation after that.
Okay.
So there's
So
always a breath work component for me, and then there's meditation.
so it sounds like your 11 minutes is sort of like your non-negotiable.
Yes, which is
Okay.
so helpful to have. I tell this to all my clients: have something that you can do that
Yeah.
you have to do, a
Right.
non-negotiable.
Yeah.
And I've settled on that breath practice. And then nature plays a huge role for me. I'm an
Mhm.
avid rock climber, mountain biker. I love backpacking and hiking. I do a little bit of surfing and snowboarding.
You're in California?
Hmm.
Oh, that's right. Are you in the Santa Cruz area? Is that what
I'm
you
in.
said?
I'm right here in Santa Cruz near
Oh,
downtown.
okay.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, you're very close to my hometown of San Ho. So,
Nice.
yeah, that's a really strong community of people that are very connected to nature. There's so much access to the ocean and hiking. And what's
Hmm.
so interesting is I used to ask people what they did for fun, and almost without exception, people would include an activity in nature,
Hmm.
something that is just so rejuvenating.
Hmm. Yeah.
Let me ask you, do you also attend meetings like recovery meetings, 12 step or any kind of group meetings?
Yeah, I do. Thank you for asking. So I go to Recovery 2.0 um, events. I've been falling off of that a little bit lately. I need to tune back in, but um, you know, I stay connected to Recovery 2.0 and pop into to Tommy's. He's got a great Thursday evening sangha or spiritual community where you can do Q&A with him, and uh, that's been something that I keep coming back to. And then here we have a program. I'm sort of working in partnership with some local nonprofits to try to develop more programming that combines different populations. So, for example, special needs folks and
Hmm.
people in recovery. So you have, you sort of can give purpose by combining those populations. A recovery person might find purpose in being with somebody who has special needs and maybe helping them, or somebody with living with disabilities. And then when you have connection and community forming that benefits everyone. Uh, at the moment, one of those nonprofits locally takes a sailboat out twice a week with a group of people in recovery or with disabilities, and I pop in on those boat rides from time to time.
Wow, that sounds amazing. It's such a beautiful area that you're in to be out on the water.
Yeah.
Um, that is awesome. The special needs people, are they like, is it like mental disabilities or is it physical people like in wheelchairs or who have trouble getting to meetings? What kind of?
A couple folks in wheelchairs and some more developmental, mental, on that side of things.
Oh, okay.
Hmm.
Got it. Yeah, we've had some people in our community, in the community in San Jose who had difficulty getting to meetings. So it was nice that people did that as an act of service. I
Hmm.
find that service is one of the best ways to sort of like rebuild your self-esteem, like just being useful to someone else. It's hard to look into the eyes of gratitude and not feel a little bit better about yourself.
So true. Yeah, I
Yeah.
completely agree with that.
Yeah. That's really sounds like a really good program that you're developing and much needed. Do you have I've been talking about spiritual experience stories because I began to realize somewhere along the line that, you know, when I was asking people for like their spiritual experience stories, it was either like a life experience, like a something happened, like a situation, or people also maybe describe a spiritual experience as what spirituality is for them and how they feel connected. Do you have a story that relates a spiritual experience for you?
100%. Yes. And I'm sure there's many,
Yeah.
but I'll just go straight to the moment in my life when I got sober. When I first decided to get totally clean, sober, stop all drugs and alcohol, I had an incredible experience that I'll have to do my best to describe. It was a very spiritual feeling, and it almost felt like I had surrendered so much because I had to. that I felt like my ego let go, and I was just free from all the contents of my mind. Like Ram Dass says, let the thoughts and judgments of the mind be thoughts and judgments of the mind, and you exist behind that. Well,
Mm.
I had a real, it was almost like a handout from the universe, uh, because it just happened rather than, meditating or cultivating it. It really just sort of struck like lightning at that time.
Mm.
And I think I had laid some groundwork maybe for that to happen, but I was just outside of my mind all of a sudden. So that what was happening didn't, it was just there, and that was okay. It actually didn't direct my feelings or behaviors anymore. And saw myself walking through life. It was almost like watching my body, and my mind wasn't leading anymore, and my body would lead me. And it was to the point where I would walk through a grocery store and I couldn't even buy the same food as before because my hand would go towards it and then it would just hesitate. And my body would sort of go away from that and lead me over to the fruits and vegetables, for
Mm.
example. And it was like my body was just guiding me through. Uh, and it was just like living on a different plane. It was such a peaceful experience, and it flowed, and things that had been hard before weren't hard anymore. There was a psychological exhaustion that I had been going through that was no longer happening. Um, and that gradually tapered into kind of coming back down a little bit into, you know, daily life and establishing routine, uh, and now that state is very much something that I continue to harbor in my heart and to cultivate through the practices that I have. But it was just very, very strong at that time.
Wow. It sounds like it really had such an impact on your life. That's really profound.
Yeah, thank you.
Um, okay, so now I want to go back a little bit to sort of family of origin stuff because it never ceases to fascinate me, how childhood impacts the rest of our life. Like the childhood situations, shape who we think that we are and what we're capable of. It's where all your beliefs are established in childhood. So can you tell me a little bit about your family of origin, maybe, and then transition a little bit to like when you started using and how that
Mm.
went for you?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. I'm still trying to unpack, but my family was really is a really a wonderful family, and I remember having a great childhood. I really do. I remember having a good childhood, enjoying myself, feeling safe, feeling loved. My parents were very attentive and very intentional with what they would do. They looked, I think they really found an amazing school to put us in. Um, and, at the same time, I think it's easy to be a little bit blind to where there may have been some struggles or maybe some trauma or just things in the family. Like, for example, there's alcoholism on both sides of my family. My father was an alcoholic, and fortunately, he stopped drinking before having any children. He stopped drinking shortly after getting together with my mother, I believe. But when I look back at that, he went to AA for a while, um, and the story, the way he tells it, is he went to AA for a while, and then he sort of felt like he didn't really need it anymore, and then he went out and he went on with his life, and he just stayed sober. And I mean, the man is sober to this day. He's got, I don't
Wow.
know, like over 20 years, 30. I mean, I'm 29, so he's got more than 30 years, right? Um, but I do feel like maybe there was a program missing there.
Mm, mhm.
Um, I don't remember, I think he did a lot of amazing things for the family, and he was really devoted to that. And he worked the job he needed to work to make the money he needed to make to support us and give us a good life. And that's sort of what he was doing. And now uh, he's gravitated a lot more towards just sort of passions and things
Mm.
that light him up. It's been so beautiful to see that. And I think he's happier now than I may have ever seen him.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah. And my mom is intensely focused on personal development work, transformation. She had my sister and I as children participating in transformational works. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Landmark Forum,
Oh, yeah.
or
Yeah.
she put me in the Landmark Forum when I was 9 years old.
Was
And
there
then
one just for kids?
there was one just for kids. Yeah,
Oh, that's
exactly.
awesome.
And I credit a lot of my still being alive and ability to thrive and be well and whatever good things I have at this point, I credit a lot to my mom and the way that she directed us to transformation, to think outside of the box really early on. And it was interesting because that gave me a lot of tools to work with. It also felt a little bit isolating because I
Mm.
was walking through a world where nobody else, most other people, did not have that perspective.
Right.
So I learned a lot of things at an early age. For example, being 100% responsible for your experience of life. And I wish that that was what they were teaching in all elementary schools across the country and the world. But it's not really, to my knowledge.
Mm-mm.
And I know there's some that do incorporate teachings along those lines, and that's wonderful, but it doesn't feel like it's the focus to me. And I worked in elementary schools for a while, um, later on in life, but I digress. So, I had a really good relationship with my sister. We were best friends. I have one older sister, and we would hang out together a lot. And later on, um, when I entered high school, we moved towns. My sister started dating an older guy, and she's 2.5 years older than me. She started dating an older guy, and we would all hang out, and the marijuana trickled down to
Ah,
me through that channel. you
okay.
know
The trusted older.
Trusted older sibling.
Yeah.
I was totally blindly following, like it was the coolest thing I could do, as I said.
It's super fun at that age.
It was super fun, super different, and it actually felt like it opened up conversations
Mm.
that were more along the lines of what was going on in my mind. Like I remember thinking at an early age, like maybe around 12, 13, 14, I remember thinking a lot about, did consciousness precede material reality? Or didn't material reality give rise to consciousness? I mean, it's
That's a
just,
deep, that's a deep thought.
that's what was going on in my head.
Wow.
I
Yeah.
just, I can remember being about 9 years old, looking out the window of a moving car and thinking, I'm a person. What does that mean?
At 9.
Yeah, I just remember feeling like everybody in the car, like I knew that they were people, and I knew I was a person too. And I was thinking, what makes us people? Is it our bodies? That there's a distinction between a human body and the experience of a personality. And I was just thinking about, what it is to be a person, and how people are sort of acting out a psychosocial role. I didn't have the language for it,
Right.
but that's what I was thinking about. I could,
Those are deep thoughts for a 9-year-old.
right. So, that's, that seemed to be in my nature, just philosophy and
Okay.
deep thought. And when cannabis came around, it was like those were the
Ooh,
conversations all of a sudden that people were having.
gas on a flame.
Right. And I was like, thank you. Where has this been?
Wow.
What? Because I was frustrated at that point because I felt
Mm,
like nobody else was talking about this or
right.
thinking about it. And I
Yeah.
was like, how can people just be obsessed with their nail polish colors and the latest song and nothing against pop culture, but
Well, hey.
I was kind of confused. It didn't seem like what was going on in my head was going on in most people's heads.
Right.
And I think
Yeah.
that contributed to my really leaning on cannabis when it came into my life.
Yeah, that's fair. Those are really deep thoughts for such a young man. And I can imagine how isolating that must have felt to be like, to be having these questions and frustrated with not being able to get any answers. Like nobody wants to talk to a 9-year-old about a philosophy. Um, so I'm sure that must have been a really frustrating experience. Let's fast forward. I know we're on a little bit of a time constraint, and there's so much I want to ask you about in terms of when did you decide to, because you quit drinking first and then you stopped smoking weed. And I'm really interested in the thought process of when you decided that stopping weed was also important to you. Did something happen where you were just like, I can't do this anymore?
Yeah, I would say actually it was the other way around a little bit for me. I never really liked alcohol that much, but I did
Hmm.
use it. And cannabis had been for 6 years an everyday, all day, for the most part,
I understand.
practice. Like, yeah,
Yes.
yeah, consumption for me. So
Mhm.
that had really been with me from about 14 until the time I was almost 20. I was still 19, and at that point, things had progressed to the point where I was using substances I never intended to use. I never thought I would be doing, like taking Adderall, for example, in college to try to study,
Mhm.
you know, prescription drugs that weren't prescribed to me. I remember crushing up Adderall and other sort of stimulants and laying them out on my bedside table the night before so that I could just roll right over in the morning and use that without getting out of bed. And that was to help me to get out of bed so I could go make coffee and roll a
Oh.
joint.
Mhm.
And that's where it landed me. And at some point, I looked around and I said, this is not the path that I want. I can't be who I want to be in the world if I continue down this path. And I had friends at that point who had moved on to opiates. I had friends who had moved on to harder drugs. I had seen people spiral into homelessness. I had seen people die, and I just finally woke up. Some part of me woke up and said, "You're not going to be able to make the contribution you want to make to the world." And I had this sort of the blessing that sometimes happens to people where I really couldn't enjoy using cannabis or any other substance all that much anymore. It just was so out of alignment for me. And I every time I used it, it confirmed that more and more. And finally, um, I had a very good influence in my life. And because cannabis is so tricky, right? It never gives you a good enough reason to quit.
Yeah.
It's like it's so tempting to try to moderate, or I want to use it occasionally, or and I had tried all that stuff and it wasn't happening,
Mm.
right? So finally, a family friend who had been down the same path and he had been in recovery for 25 years, maybe 30 years, a long time. And he said to me, Jake, there's no rock bottom with weed. It's just trapdoors until you die. And he had been through it. I mean, he said, "Listen, I did the same thing you're doing. But I raised my kids that way. I had a whole marriage start and end that way. I had my whole career that way." I mean, he was like 60, 65 maybe at this point. And um, he had just been already through, I think he maybe got sober when he was in his 40s, something like that.
Mhm.
And he was like, "Listen, man, you're 19 years old. Imagine if you stopped right now, what would be possible?" And he said, "Go to a meeting and ask for a sponsor." And I did that. And the 12-step meetings, Narcotics Anonymous, and sometimes Alcoholics Anonymous really helped me, especially at the beginning.
Yeah.
So I started going to 2 meetings a week. And I stopped everything at that point. And then later on down the road, about 2 years into being completely clean from everything, I decided, alcohol was never really my problem. Right? This is classic. This is in the readings at every
There
single
we
12
go.
step meeting. I
Yeah.
said, alcohol's never really my problem. Let me try to drink responsibly. And it turns out that I can kind of force myself to do that, but it's not what I want. It's
Right.
not fun for me. I don't want to
Can't
use alcohol in
control and enjoy
moderation.
can't control it and enjoy it.
No, I don't want it in moderation. I don't want
Mhm.
small amounts of it. I either would rather have a clear head or I want to use as much of it as I want. And as much of it
I
as I want
understand.
is destructive. So
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so it's been a while. It's been over 5 years since you stopped using cannabis, like all things. Is that accurate?
I I first quit 9 years ago, everything.
Okay.
And then after 2 years, I dabbled with trying to drink. That lasted about a year and a half. I never went back to anything else.
Oh, okay.
And
For
I
some reason, I
dabbled,
thought you didn't smoke weed after that. No.
I never relapsed on
Really?
marijuana. No, to this
Okay.
day, I have not. Um,
Well, that's
I,
awesome.
yeah, but I think if I had continued drinking, that would have become more and more likely. In
Yeah.
fact, it definitely became more and more likely. When I was drinking, I started smoking tobacco again.
I did too.
Oh, and I had quit that, so then I had to go through the process of quitting both those things again, and
Mhm.
that was like over 5.5 years ago at this point. So I've been off of everything again for 5.5 years
Well, that's
consecutively.
amazing. Congratulations. I know it's not easy. And you're so young. That's amazing. You have a lot of years ahead of you, and it's amazing.
Thank you.
Just good to be sober. I wanted to bring up a couple of things I know you specifically focus on cannabis. Let's just call it cannabis. It sounds so professional, medical. But there's a lot of discussion in the recovery communities about medicinal uses. There's some pros and cons, let's say, and those of us that are dedicated to being open-minded, honest, and willing will have to concede that for some people in the world, maybe not in the recovery community, there are some medical uses. And I just want to throw out some information that in preparation for our conversation, I went to Mayo Clinic and was sort of looking at, when is medical marijuana appropriate? And I recognized some things immediately where I could validate, people that are on cancer, going through cancer treatments have really
Mm,
severe nausea and vomiting. So I totally get that. I know people that suffer with MS and epilepsy and seizures. Um, but I think it could also be a slippery slope for people that are in recovery.
mhm,
There's all this talk about California sober. I
mm,
certainly have my opinions about that, but I'll first say I have no opinions on what anybody else should do I feel like people need to do whatever it is that they need to do. I know for me, I can't do it because I'm like you, I'm like an all or nothing girl.
Right.
Like if I can't be high 24/7, then I don't need to be high at all. Like I
Right.
wish I could casually do heroin, but that doesn't be a thing for me. I never tried it, but do you know what I'm saying?
Oh
Yeah,
my
there's
God.
no casual usage. But do
100%.
what are your honest feelings about like the California sober thing? Is that a thing? I don't think it's a thing.
Oh man. Okay. This is going to be so great to unpack. Let me just pause for a second because my 10 o'clock is giving me grace. She
No.
actually wants to defer.
Oh
So,
yeah.
we'll have plenty
Okay.
of time. Let me just text her back and then,
Oh yay. Oh,
yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
I don't mean yay for whatever. You know what I mean?
No, I'm happy this is happening. It'll be good. Um, I'm telling her I'll send her the interview.
Actually, I think I'm going to publish it this week because I have so many ladies already interviewed, and I was like, "Ooh, where are my homeboys at?" I need to
Totally.
yeah,
Yeah.
I try to alternate,
Right.
yeah.
Awesome. That's great that you're doing that. Okay,
Okay,
cool.
so
So
tell
we're
me
good.
about your tell me about your thoughts on California sober.
Okay, let's start. You know
It's
it's
such
gonna.
a it's such a hot topic for some people. People get pissed about this.
Oh
Okay, but
yeah.
let me hear what you think.
You know I have a lot of thoughts when I start with. Okay.
Okay.
um, the the Cali sober term. Let's just start with the terminology.
Okay.
Here's my thing about the terminology. Why put the word sober in there? That's my feeling.
Exactly.
You can say I'm alcohol free.
Yeah.
There's so many ways to say it. You can say I've stopped drinking or I don't drink alcohol. No booze for me. You know, I just don't see a reason to conflate the word sober with smoking marijuana as an alternative. I think that perhaps we'd be better off avoiding that terminology just for the sake of the spectrum of addiction, the spectrum of people who are dealing with sobriety. I'm not saying that it's illegitimate to stop alcohol and use marijuana. I will say right now that in, I think, almost any case of alcoholism, if somebody's using alcohol in a destructive way, especially if they're using it daily, if they make the switch to using cannabis, I do think that's a step in the right direction. Only because, and I'm talking about people who successfully stop alcohol for a long period of time, they don't go back to it, and they only now use cannabis. Is that better than using alcohol all the time or using both? Yes, I would say yes. You can just look to accident and death statistics for that.
Right.
You're not as likely to crash your car. You're not as likely to be involved in an emergency room visit. You're not as likely to be involved in domestic violence.
Right.
So we could make a strong argument that it's a step in the right direction. However,
It's like harm reduction.
it's harm reduction. However, there's a couple things to consider, which is that marijuana is going to fire a lot of the circuits that are fired for pleasure, which has a real potential to excite the neurocircuitry that would make somebody want to go back to their drug of choice.
Hmm.
That's been well documented at this point.
Yeah.
That's why I started smoking cigarettes again when I started drinking. They wire together,
Goes
they
together.
fire together,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So I think risk of relapse back to your drug of choice is always going to be higher if you're hanging on to habitual use of a substance. I also think that, but some people would argue against that. Some people would say, no, if I let go of the weed, I'm going to suffer so much that I'm going to go back to alcohol. So that's a debatable point. What gets me with chronic marijuana use as an alternative is it just presents itself as so seductive to anybody who wants to get on the path of sobriety. They can say, "Oh, here's this thing that's less harmful or even medicinal." And that's the line that starts to get really threatening to me for the recovery world,
Yeah.
because especially if we popularize a term like California sober and start
Yeah.
conflating those two worlds, I just see a lot of people could be hooked by the idea that they could still use something. And that's sad to me. It's tragic because people are trying to free themselves from dependency on a
Hmm.
substance.
Hmm.
And these substances, cannabis, no different than alcohol, chronic use depletes your body's natural resources. Your body will produce less of its own dopamine, less of its own cannabinoids, less of the good stuff on its own when you're using the drug regularly. So you're still, there's still just a lot of potential detriments. And I hate to see people who might otherwise walk a path of recovery and healing in which they get to know themselves and heal at the level of having everything they need within them, utilizing their internal resources. I mean, that's a challenging path, but it's so rewarding. And I get that
Yeah.
the path isn't the same for everyone, but I think cannabis has the potential to keep people stuck in an addiction
Yeah.
for a lot longer than they otherwise would if they fall into the idea that that's an acceptable form of recovery.
Right.
Um,
When I was getting sober, I was on what they called we used to call it the marijuana maintenance program in the beginning, right? And it's like I quit drinking, and then there was a 5 month period where I was still smoking weed. And for me, it was a step in the right direction. Although it wasn't like harm reduction was an idea that, people really it wasn't a term people were using, harm reduction, but that's really what it was for me. I didn't have any tools I didn't have that sufficient substitute that they talk about. So removal of the things that were helping me manage my feelings, without something else, that was really problematic for me for a variety
mm,
of reasons.
mm,
I feel like the thing that really bothers me about a using cannabis in recovery is that for me, I mean, the Pink Floyd "Comfortably Numb," that was my anthem. I just
mhm,
wanted to be, it helped not help me numb my feelings. And in recovery is about recovering your whole self, right? The good feelings and the bad. And I actually needed to feel when it's hard it's hard to know, sort of like what you want or where your boundaries are or how you're feeling if you're always numb, right? It's
mhm,
like, how can you communicate to others what you want and what you need if you're numb to your own feelings,
mhm,
right? You don't really get to experience who you really are if you're always numb.
mhm,
And so for me, that's why it was problematic. I had this experience where I was out walking the dog. I was like early in recovery, and I was feeling bad because I had gotten high after I started my AA journey, and I smoked weed, and I was feeling bad about it because I was like really grouchy with my family. Like it made me like really irritable afterwards. And I was like, this is not who I want to be. I like you, I was like not in alignment with who I wanted to be. And I realized, you know what? I'm powerless over this too. When I take that into my body, I am powerless to like not be cranky after. Like
Hmm.
I can't control like the cause and effect. If I invoke the cause, which is smoking weed, I will experience the effect. That's the whole point, right?
Hmm.
That's where the idea of powerlessness comes in. But being numb and dependent, and it actually, there was another factor there, the impairment, so it was impairing my ability to perceive cognitive functions, where like I thought I was stupid, and I wasn't. I was just high a lot of the time.
Yeah,
Right. um,
yeah.
so I feel like for me, um, that's why I had to change my behavior, because it was impairing my growth, because I wasn't able to feel the things I needed to feel in order to be able to communicate my needs to others, or really get in touch with the pain from childhood to resolve it, right? To process that hidden pain to resolution. So I'm
Mhm.
curious, how do you work with people in your practice to help them stop using? Is it addressing first that it is a problem, and then how to stop? What does that look like for you?
Yeah, well, I recommend people have layers of support.
Okay.
So I start out by just sort of pointing to the tendency to underestimate how much support we need and how big a
Yeah.
transformation it is, right?
Yeah.
And that is, it has some parallels to step one, admitting you have you're powerless, admitting you have a problem, and not underestimating that. That's kind of what I start out with. So I recommend that everybody have, if possible, one-on-one support, group support,
Mhm.
and I really like to point towards the power of recreation. So
Mm.
I start to really encourage my clients. One of the things I do with clients is right off the bat, we start to look at what are the passions for them recreationally that they've either lost touch with or are not as connected to as they could be, or that they never have started, that they want to, that they can now bring into their lives in the absence of addiction, because addiction takes up time, energy, and money. And it actually is, when you look at it, a hobby. Like marijuana is the hobby. When my clients come to me, marijuana has been their hobby for years,
Yeah.
or maybe alcohol has been their hobby. It takes time, energy, and money, and it becomes a lifestyle. That's what a hobby is.
Mhm.
And I work with the mindset that the tendency to sort of go all into something, the tendency to, what we call an addictive personality, I look at as an all-in drive that actually can be operated as a huge asset. When it's channeled into something detrimental, it has obvious consequences. When it's channeled into something productive or enriching or enlightening, it is incredibly helpful.
Yeah.
So, people who have a tendency to use marijuana daily or be in an addiction with a substance, I think have an asset that we are sitting on that we haven't learned how to channel. And when we can channel it into a passion, like for a recreational hobby or a purpose, a life path, a career
Mhm.
path, it can serve us tremendously. My own quality, that quality in me has served me tremendously in business and in all of my recreation, all of the outdoor sports that I love. It's been a huge asset for helping me excel, because I get really, really into the things that I like,
Mhm.
and I keep going back. And so we look at it that way, and we start to find healthier ways to channel that. And then I do a lot of breath work, meditation to lay the groundwork for some mindfulness practice. I do that in every session with my clients.
Sorry to interrupt you. Do you meditate with them during a session?
Mm-hmm.
Like 5 or 10 minutes in the beginning or something?
Yes,
Ooh, that sounds
exactly.
good.
Yeah, I usually open with a different breathwork practice in each session, and then leading a little bit of meditation after that. Might be 5 to 15 minutes. Um, and it
That's,
often feels a lot longer than that, which is nice.
it does feel like it's, but you know what? There is, I feel like when you meditate with somebody, like the energy between the two of you, or maybe it's like an accountability factor, there is something that draws me into presence more than when I meditate by myself.
Hmm.
Sometimes it's just hard to make myself sit. I try to do it in the morning, but sometimes I find that I'm squirrely and doing breath work first, like you mentioned. Like, this is what works for me. Like, I'm so glad you're saying that. This is what works for me, doing breath. Have you ever tried Wim Hof?
I have done that a couple times.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he's got a fun YouTube video that has some graphics to help you stay in the rhythm of breathing. But sometimes if I do the breathing first, like, it helps my body to settle. Like, my body is restless, but doing the breathing first helps my body to settle, and then I can get still and quiet and then feel that connection. But I think that's brilliant that you do that with your clients.
I totally relate. I use breath work as an access point to meditation
Yeah.
a lot, or I use chanting for that same purpose. It just
Oh,
makes it
chanting.
easier for me to transition. My mind has something to focus on,
Yeah.
and then it helps me settle my nervous system and my thoughts, and it makes meditative states more accessible for me after that. So I
Yeah.
completely relate.
Accessible. Yeah. My brain is so busy all the time. It's, I can't, sometimes I can't quite settle, but that's really good that you did it with your clients. Do you encourage your clients to, you said layers of support? They're working one-on-one with you. What kinds of group supports do you recommend?
Yeah, so I pace people to go out and explore different recovery resources. So their
Mhm.
homework assignment 1 week, in addition to whatever journaling and other things we come up
Yeah,
with.
always meditation, journaling, breathing. Yeah.
Yeah. But there often is, every week, okay, what meeting are you going to try out? What meeting are you going to go to? And often I'm providing accountability for exploring resources. And then when they find one that they like, then we set goals around that. Are you going to go to one meeting a week, two meetings a week? Let me know when you go to a meeting. You can get extra brownie points for that.
Yeah.
Um, and I like to encourage people to work with a sponsor as well through the step work
Yeah.
process. Some people come to me having done that already, some people come to me having never done that. And then I like to recommend Recovery 2.0.
Of course.
Yeah, and then I do have my own group coaching program at this point.
Oh, nice.
It's called the Inner Ascent uh, group coaching program, and I actually have a therapist and a nutritionist on staff for that program who are teaching inside the group along with me. And the my good friend Zoe Gillis is a therapist. She is teaching about trauma and the way that can play in to addiction and how to heal from that.
Oh, yeah. That's
And,
huge. That's a huge, in my mind, everything, so all roads lead to the need to heal trauma. That's brilliant that you
yeah,
have that. What was her,
yeah.
I'm sorry, what was her name? Zoe
Zoe Gillis.
Gillis.
She is amazing. She leads women's backpacking retreats in
Wow.
the LA area
Okay.
regularly for anybody who might be interested in that. And you
Okay. I'll
can
see if I can, if later I'll have you send me a link to her stuff and I'll put it in the show notes.
totally. And then there's an amazing woman, Kelly Miller.
Mhm.
Her She goes by the title The Addiction Nutritionist. That's her Instagram handle
Ooh.
and her website. And she's teaching about nutrition inside of the Inner Ascent program. She's teaching about the ways that impacts recovery. And she actually gave a a detox protocol for each of the main substances that people kind of come into the group dealing with, which are alcohol, marijuana, and tobacco. No surprise, those are the top three most widely used substances,
Hmm.
other than caffeine.
Right. I am not giving up caffeine.
No, not yet. I haven't
That's
gotten there yet.
that's my stronghold. That's my last vice, for heaven's sakes.
Totally. So
Okay,
yeah,
she sounds amazing. So I'll leave links to both of them. Addiction
awesome.
nutritionist. Man, I feel like I don't know if do you let me ask you since you're a man. Do you see in the recovery community that men struggle with eating disorders the way women do? I just don't see it because I spend a lot of time in women's meetings and I work with women. Do you see it in the men's groups?
I have seen, I would say just intuitively, I've seen more women struggle with
Yeah.
eating disorder stuff. But I've definitely seen it in men also.
Yeah.
And I think it maybe like subclinically, there's a lot going on with nutrition that, maybe people not qualifying as having eating disorders, I think still have huge room for growth in their relationship to food, myself
Right.
included. I'm
Yeah.
still getting, better at that. And, but it's made a
Always
huge
you have
difference
room.
for me.
Always room for improvement. Yeah, especially it's interesting, when you're first coming out of addiction, especially, alcohol is so hard on your body. So I love this idea of nutrition specifically for people coming out of addiction.
Hmm.
That's brilliant.
Hmm.
Um, what else did I want to ask you about? We talked a little bit about the pros and cons. Um, I think what else do people need to know that I haven't asked you about? Maybe why cannabis is a problem?
Yeah, so I'll speak, from experience. And again, I want to circle back a little bit to the question of, cannabis and recovery. I really do recognize that everybody's path is different. And some people have been through a lot of trauma, more than
Yeah.
I, God willing, more than I will ever get close to going through in my
Mhm.
entire lifetime, I hope. And that's not to say I don't have my own stuff. Uh, and there have been some traumas that I didn't go into, but people have been through things that are I can't imagine. And I think we all have to, at the end of the day, trust ourselves and trust our hearts, but we need to be very, very careful. We need to listen for actual truth, which means being willing to hear truths that do not lead us to what might seem most pleasurable. We need to be willing to prioritize growth and inner peace over pleasure. And we need to ask ourselves, am I looking for a way to do the same thing that I've been doing, just in a different way? Because if that's what's happening, then are we really growing? And I talk to a lot of people on a daily basis who quit alcohol a long time ago, or quit meth or crack or harder drugs, and have been hanging on to cannabis for years or
Mhm.
decades, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, and beyond. And they come to me and they say, I have not been able to quit this thing, and it's really impacting my life. And I have an intake survey that I use when people get on a call with me, and I ask them, what do you think your life would look like in 10 years if nothing changed? And then I ask them, how would that feel? And I get so many, almost everybody, I would say more than, I would say 75% or more of the people that come in talking to me tell me that they wouldn't want to be alive anymore if nothing changed in 10 years, that they would be so unhappy with who they've been in their lives that they might feel as though they don't want to really be here anymore.
Oh.
And that's the tragedy to me of what cannabis does. It's seductive because it's not as harmful, but it
Mhm.
has the ability to just hold you down and not allow you to really shine your light. It's proven to affect focus and memory and cognition. It slows you down. It changes the way people speak. as you know from the Huberman Lab episode, and it it just like any drug, it's so tempting to believe that certain things are like a biochemical free ride, that
Mhm.
there's no downsides. But watch, I'm just telling you, watch. This is what has happened with every drug that has ever hit the market that seemed to be a miracle drug. People get very excited about it. This happened with opiates. This
Mhm.
happened with tobacco. This has happened with every drug throughout history, that mind altering drugs. Maybe not every drug, but there's a pattern where something appears to be only positive, but then over the years we see side effects, we see consequences, we see a lot of different things emerging with long-term use. And I think we have to be very careful not to market cannabis as wellness, and not to market cannabis as um, like a path of recovery that's really widely advocated for. I mean, I recognize that it could be a part of the process for some people, but I just think in the recovery world we have to be uh, really intentional with where we're having our conversations, and having full conversations, like acknowledging the other side of the conversation, whenever we're talking about this stuff.
Right.
Um, yeah,
No, that's really important to be able to talk it out and examine honestly and openly, both sides, pros and cons. But I really like what you said about, prioritizing growth. And I do believe that cannabis will stunt your emotional and spiritual growth because it does numb you out. It does detach you from your feelings.
yeah, with chronic use especially. And I think that using daily, people just, Andrew Huberman says it perfectly. He says, I'm not telling you what to do. He says, do as you like, but know what you're doing.
Yeah.
And
I think I actually wrote that quote down. Do as you wish, know what you're doing. Like he was like, yeah. So just, do it with, I think, motive and awareness about what
yeah,
it actually is really important. He did mention, I thought was, we were talking about science earlier and why, some people lean on science. I sort of lean towards the science, probably to a fault. But I thought what was so interesting is like one of the arguments the pro arguments for it is that it's a plant and that your body has cannabinoid receptors anyway. But what he was saying is that the THC attaches to those same receptors, but has an impact that's 1,000 times fold
hmm,
greater and more intense than naturally androgynous? No,
endogenous.
endogenous.
Yeah,
Androgynous. That's a whole other thing. But your naturally occurring chemicals in your body don't begin to it begins to skew like your dopamine reward system, and it creates this dependency, and it triggers a whole cascade of problems that are those of us in recovery really need to be careful of.
yes.
So in my mind, I come back to this idea of abstinence with a sufficient substitute, because I think it would be cruel to, people are using these things because they have emotional pain, right? Gabor Mate says, don't ask why the addiction, ask why the pain.
Hmm.
So, I see that people are using these things to treat their emotions, not their physical conditions like MS or glaucoma, seizures, or those other things. They're using
100,
it to treat emotions. So I think for me that's probably a red flag.
100%. And I think that right now we live in a world where a lot of people who are using cannabis frequently, I think arguably do not fall into the category of knowing what they're doing, right? Do as you
Mm,
wish, but know what you're doing. I didn't know what I was doing. There wasn't
yeah.
even research out about cannabis when I was using it. Some of the earliest medical journal articles that I've read that really are starting to explore whether cannabis could be addictive are from 2014.
Oh,
2014.
That's not that long ago.
No, I was already 4 years into using it every day at that point.
Yeah, when I was smoking weed back in the day when I was 14, it's a little bit longer ago than you. Was they were saying that it was non-addictive and I was like, "Oh, that's interesting." I smoked non-addictive marijuana for probably a good 10 years
Yeah,
daily, like 24/7.
right.
I
And
was absolutely
that's,
emotionally addicted to it.
yeah, and that's, I think, what's tricky with cannabis. I think we're living in a paradigm that points to it being non addictive and harmless, and it is certainly neither of those things. So
Mhm.
that's another thing I really want to throw this statistic out there and make sure people are aware. If you're struggling with cannabis use, you are not alone, and there is not something wrong with you. It is absolutely something that can be addictive.
Yeah.
In fact, we have clear data at this point that 9% of users get addicted, experience a substance use disorder with cannabis. 9%.
That
It's
seems low.
well, that's, we're talking about qualifying for an actual substance use disorder, right? So if you look at problematic use, anything subclinical,
Yeah.
people that maybe they don't qualify for full blown substance use, but they might feel like on some level it's holding them back, right? Those more subtle cases, it's
Well,
probably way higher than that.
that speaks
But
to what you said earlier about there's no rock bottom. It's a series of trapdoors till you die.
mm-hmm,
Yeah. That it's still
yeah,
problematic because it does numb your pain, but you don't ever grow without. I mean, well, you know what they say, touchstone is the pain is the touchstone of all growth, right? And if, some pain is like growing pains are kind of necessary. Like you go to the gym, you experience soreness. I almost equate that to emotional growth. If you do some deep emotional work, like 12-step work, which is mostly a self-examination process and taking responsibility, I mean, that shit's painful, right?
mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm,
so if you're numb to your feelings, and by the way, you don't get to choose which feelings you numb out. Like when you're
right,
numb, you also
you're
numb
numb.
out your joy. And although I suppose some would argue if you're on THC, it's a lot of fun. So
Well, here's the thing. That's something I want to address because you get high from weed, but you don't just get high. You get a high and a low. With any mind altering drug, that's what you get.
yeah,
I wish I could tell you otherwise. I really do. But you don't just get a high, you get a high and a low because those cannabinoids are out competing your body's natural resources,
right.
and your resources diminish as a result. So you get high, certainly, but then the light of your life gets dimmer the rest of the time. With chronic use,
Yeah,
you are dimming your joy in between your sessions of using, and all your joy, it all gets concentrated in experiencing your joy through the drug. So you trap your joy, you kind of push
yeah,
it into a corner, and that doesn't lead to positive outcomes in
yeah.
life, or at
It's all
least not
bad.
optimal ones.
Have you been exposed to that book by Dr. Anna Lemke? It's Andrew Huberman's colleague at Stanford. She wrote a book called Dopamine Nation.
Oh yeah, I've
Yeah, she
heard
has
of
this
it.
great, yeah, she has a great example of the teeter-totter, right? Your brain is always seeking homeostasis. So yeah, you might get high, but then you have the equal opposite low afterwards.
Mhm.
Right. And then your body has to work towards homeostasis again. So it's the what did I said teeter-totter. Is that the same thing as a seesaw?
Yeah, yeah,
Did you know what I mean? It's like
yeah.
however high you get, you're going to experience the equal opposite low after, and
Mhm.
then your body restabilizes. So there is always a price to pay when you get high.
Right. And what I point to is that dynamic is not present in what I call the natural highs. Natural highs being highs that come from our internal resources being activated. So when you do 30 minutes of moderate to high intensity cardio, for example, your body releases its own endocannabinoids. And
Yes.
that's what's responsible for the runner's high. You get endorphins, you get dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, all of the feel good neurotransmitters are boosted by certain things. Among them are exercise, music, connection with
Mm.
other human beings. Nature does it, sunlight does it. There's all these things that are natural highs, and they only get you high. You don't come down.
Mm.
Meditation does it. Meditation is actually documented scientifically to boost your neurotransmitters at this point: dopamine, serotonin,
Oh yeah.
oxytocin, and endorphins.
Mm.
And um, and it supports your endocannabinoid system.
That's
So,
that's so
and
interesting
there's
what
no come down.
yeah, there's no come down. That's so interesting what you said about the I always think that everything in life has a price tag, right? Like exercise, um, you pay the price tag up front. Like I will exercise, but it's not my favorite thing. But like I'm sort of in the David Goggins camp of do something that sucks every day. I love that guy. Right. But he's like, do
That's good.
something that sucks every day. And I'm like, okay, it sucks. I will do it. But I'm paying the price up front because I do get that high after.
Mhm.
Right. But I didn't even consider the highs that come without a price tag, like meditation. I suppose like forcing yourself to submit, like overcoming your body's resistance or your emotional resistance. But I love that idea of like, I mean, you could just literally sit down and be quiet and visualize something that brings you, feelings of peace and euphoria, connecting out in nature. That seems like a no cost, no price tag experience.
Yeah, totally. And for me, like, my best two examples are mountain biking and climbing.
Both
I don't
painful.
well, certainly there's an energy exertion for sure. And are
Yeah,
there days where I don't really
that's
feel
good
like
for you.
training? Sure. But I love mountain biking and climbing.
Yeah.
I cannot wait to get out again. And that's why I think the holy grail of natural highs is to find the ones you don't have to force, the ones you
Ah,
cannot wait to do again. And I see this a lot in exercise. A lot of
yeah.
people feel like it's something they have to force themselves to do. And I get that. I have a little David Goggins in me too.
So you love him.
It's good for you to be able to push past resistance,
Right.
absolutely. And I think the less resistance, the ways of living with the least resistance possible, the more we can hone in on that, the
Mhm.
better. So if somebody can find a form of movement that they love,
Movement.
that they actually feel excited to do again, then the exercise just happens. I wouldn't be
Right.
in shape if it wasn't for climbing and mountain
Yeah.
biking and these things I love to do. I just don't think I would grit my teeth and go to the gym every day, you
Right.
know?
Yeah.
Um,
I love that. Find
yeah,
something that you don't have to force.
yeah,
Movement.
yeah,
Well, my dear friend, I could talk to you all day. We've already been chatting for about an hour and a half. So
yeah.
I just want to thank you so much for spending this time with me. I'm going to leave links to all your things in the show notes. But for those who are listening, is there an easy way for people to get a hold of you, whether it's like on Instagram or do you have a website? What's the easiest way?
Yeah, my main platform right now is Instagram, and I'm on TikTok. You can find
Me too.
me.
That's embarrassing.
I know, right?
It's like I'm a grown ass adult on TikTok. I love it.
Right. Yes, I concede. I mean, I confess, I am on TikTok. Um, at Natural Highs Recovery is my handle on
Oh,
both.
we should. No wonder. Natural high.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's my handle on both Instagram and TikTok, and it's also
Natural
the name
highs.
of my website, naturalhighsrecovery.org. Um, I'd say probably you find my biggest community right now is on Instagram.
Okay.
Um,
I will definitely leave links in the show notes. And I excited to meet your cohorts, Zoe and Kelly. I will be leaving links to their resources as well. But I just, you're so young and you're doing so much good work. And thank you so much for all that you do for our recovery community.
You are so welcome, and I'm absolutely happy to help in any way that I can. And for anybody listening, you can schedule a completely free call through the link in my Instagram bio if you'd like to, and there's no pressure there's no sales pressure at all. I'm happy to help any listeners work through anything that they think they might be able to use a reflection for. And it's possible to explore whether any of the resources or programs that I have might be a good fit as well. All that stuff you can find on my Instagram.
Yay. Thank you so much. It was so good to speak with you today.
So good to talk to you. Thank you so much, Arlena.